Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week, we're talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that would be foraging. And as I've always said, what is a weed but a very successful plant? And there are many different ways that we can explore how to use the weeds that we find in our environments. Our guest today is Professor Phillip Stark. He is the founder of Berkeley Open Source Food and Wild and Feral Food Week that occurs each year in May. He's also a professor of statistics at Berkeley University. Phillip is passionate about urban foraging, including studying the safety, nutrition, and availability of wild foods in urban ecosystems and their value for ecosystem services and nutrition security. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Phillip. It's great to meet you.
Likewise, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah. So why don't we start with just some basic background on the importance of weeds to biodiversity and kind of how do you define a weed?
So there are a number of less technical and more technical definitions of weeds. I mean, some people say a weed is a plant whose merits are not yet known, or a weed is a plant growing someplace we don't want it to grow. But there actually are characteristics of plants that make them weedy. These include things like, as you mentioned before, how successful they are at competing with other plants, especially in given circumstances. They tend to be things that can be pollinated in a variety of ways, not just by wind or just by one insect, but by lots of different insects and things. They tend to also be able to propagate vegetatively. If you try to kill a dandelion with a hoe, you get 6 dandelions instead of a dead dandelion.
More food.
More food, exactly. They tend to have competitive strategies like starting out with a basal rosette that will smother anything else that's trying to come up. They tend to have seeds that can last in the ground a long time before germination and only start to germinate when they come up to the light. So if something disturbs the soil and brings them up. They tend to do well without extra inputs that our usual agricultural plants have. They don't need to be watered or fertilized or whatever. They thrive in a broad variety of circumstances. Now, some of them are beneficial, and some of them we maybe don't really know what to do with, or they're at least not edible. They might be a source of fiber or something else that's useful, for making things. But in general, it has to do with their ability to compete with other plants, their ability to thrive, especially a tendency to like disturbed soils, like happen where humans intervene, where when we disturb by building something or with agriculture or something else.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen this firsthand in my own research in the Mediterranean, where you'll often have agricultural plots and you have a zone known as the ecotomal zone, right? So it's kind of like the border region around your garden plots, this little bit of disturbed soil, and all of these weeds pop up. But in many cases, they're allowed to stay and flourish because local people use them as sources of food or as medicine or in other applications as well. And I think we've lost sight of the role of these weeds and within the system of modern agriculture. Most have. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, many of these have been deliberate food crops for generations and generations. They've just fallen out of fashion in the global north as we've gone to industrial scale monocropping.
Absolutely. Well, I know that you're the founder of this, and I love the title of this. It's Wild and Feral Food Week. What can you tell us about this initiative, and what does it involve?
Well, it has a number of goals. The ultimate goal is to try to create a supply chain to get these plants that are often seen as a nuisance off farms and into the food supply. I mean, foraging is one thing. It's not something that scales terribly well, although it's very important in my life. It's the way I provide a lot of the greens that I eat. But the way to change things at scale is to leverage what's going on in agriculture. These plants volunteer between the rows and at the margins of farms. They have value to farms and farmers in providing edible or economic cover crops, biodiversity, habitat for pollinators. They can contribute to the arbuscular mycorrhizal network. They have all kinds of benefits. And so the issue is, how do you get farmers to recognize that there really is value there, value in allowing them to grow and then harvesting them. How do you get things that first mile off the farm and into the food supply? How do you educate chefs, eaters, et cetera, about the merits, the fact that these are delicious and, really do present culinary opportunity, and, kind of tie things end to end. So part of this is trying to create the supply chain, working with farmers to get them to harvest these things and bring them to market, working with chefs and bartenders and distilleries and other people who make, packaged foods and other things to recognize that there's something interesting and tasty going on and make these things more familiar to eaters so that they say, oh yeah, I've seen that before. That's delicious. I had that, it really is food. So it's really trying to be an end-to-end solution and to shine some light and give some love to the foragers who are really kind of pushing the boundaries backwards in time and history towards a time when we really did all grow up learning to recognize food in the environment.
Sounds great. This idea of making use of all of the resources at a farm made me think of, it's almost like a second phase of gleaning, right? So you have a lot of gleaners come through after the first kind of crop harvest has happened. There's a lot of fruit that are perhaps left behind or weren't picked in the first pass through. And I'm wondering, is there a term for that, kind of for going through and finding those other wild species?
Well, gleaning is a reasonable term for that also, but I think kind of a better analogy is the snout to tail movement in processing animals. It's eating the whole farm in the same way that you might eat the whole animal. It's hedgerow. Instead of just the deliberate crops, there's also the volunteers.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, tell me a bit more about what you're doing at UC Berkeley. What are some of the activities that you have where you're working with students to kind of raise awareness around foraging?
So one of the things I've been involved in is a course on a student-led class on California food systems, and have them explore foraging and learn about some of the wild foods that are available, both native and non-native plants. Some of the work has been mapping the availability of these plants especially in areas that are ecologically challenged and economically challenged and don't have a ready source of fresh vegetables. So to do that, we've deliberately gone to areas that, say, were formerly shipyards and are now mixed-use residential industrial, where the soil is likely to have a high level of contamination, to see whether, when these plants volunteer there, are they safe to eat? How much is there? Could this actually be a meaningful source of nutrition for people who would ordinarily have to travel a long way to get fresh vegetables? So that's been one effort, including mapping the availability and occupancy over time, measuring the nutrition of the plants, doing toxicological tests on the plants, testing them for herbicide residues and things like that to find out whether they're safe to eat, even when the soil isn't in great shape.
No, I mean, this brings up an important point around land access and access to safe lands to both grow crops and also to, as you said, to forage safely. So this has a lot of kind of, implications for social justice around food. And I know this is also a topic that you're interested in, around decolonizing foraging and thinking about some of these social justice issues. What can you share with us about that?
So another prong of the work that we've been doing is working on policy. For example, in most places in the United States, foraging on public lands, on municipal lands, parks and whatnot is illegal. Where I live, it's illegal to take a dead leaf from a park.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's generally true in the United States. So how can we change policies so that we really do view green space as part of the commons, as a shared resource that really is a productive ecology and not just something to look at? How can we use spaces like that, whether it's municipal parks, schoolyards, or whatever, as edible gardens? I mean, one of the interesting things I've seen in looking at edible gardens in elementary schools is that very often there's more food growing outside the box than inside the box. It's just not recognized as food. There are places that have reduced or eliminated the use of herbicides to control what they view as pest plants. The next step is to use those plants as a resource. Now that you've stopped poisoning them, let's figure out what we can do with them.
Yeah. Well, in last week's episode on this show, we explored the implications of using herbicides at mass scale for monocropping. There are risks to human health and environmental health. There are a lot of downsides to this kind of approach. And I know this is, another area that you're interested in is really moving towards a more sustainable college campus space. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember her name, but it's not going to come to me right now. But by using herbicides to try to control weeds, it has unintended consequences, one of which is to select for super weeds. And very often, the plants that people see as a nuisance are in fact edible and even were cultivated deliberately historically, but have merely fallen out of fashion. Treating them as the enemy and trying to annihilate them with chemical weapons doesn't have the desired effect of eliminating them. It just has the effect of applying selective pressures that tend to reduce the favorable characteristics and accentuate the unfavorable characteristics. So, there's a vast number of the world's worst weeds, according to a survey. I would say roughly 80% of them are edible, and maybe 50% are delicious. The plants that Bay Area urban farmers and gardeners complain about, I think on the list, the 19 most frequently listed ones, I think 15 of them are edible and 11 are delicious. So why are we not managing this as a resource, and why are we instead treating it as something to try to eliminate? And the same thing happens in human health. Very often it's the case that managing a cancer is a more effective strategy than trying to eradicate the cancer because of the consequences for the rest of your body. So it's just our relationship with this really needs to change. And even on organic farms, people's relationship with weeds can be very, very different from farm to farm. There are places that will literally take a propane torch and burn the weeds seedlings as they start to come up. And there are other places that will allow them to grow as cover crops, and then either use them as green manure or feed them to the chickens or something. And then there's a much smaller number of places that will actually bring them to market.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes beyond farms. I think many of us, the audience is listening, if you have a curated green lawn in your front or backyard, you are also engaging in monoculture. And, there's a huge amount of herbicides that are dumped onto American lawns every year, especially targeting, pesky plants like dandelion. And in fact, dandelion greens are some of my favorite foods to forage. So don't try and kill them, like collect them and eat them. They're amazing. One of my favorite recipes is dandelion greens with some garlic and chickpeas as a kind of broth and soup. It's this amazing bitter deliciousness.
Yeah. So most of these herbicides target broadleaf weeds, which include a vast array of delicious, edible plants. This whole notion of a lawn is very colonial European, just a very broken aesthetic. I mean, something clicked in my brain when I started foraging a lot. And I went from seeing the manicured lawn as something pretty to seeing the manicured lawn as something that was sterile.
Yeah.
You go someplace where, people aren't dumping the chemicals on their turf, and that becomes rich and vibrant. Look, it's full of food. Look, it's amazing. Look at all this biodiversity. Look at these flowers. Look at the insects buzzing, right? It's a very different experience from a golf course.
Yeah. I think the last time this is pre-COVID, I was at a fancy event at a golf course, and we were outside, and they had, beautiful food and drinks. Everyone's looking outside. I was staring at this desolate, barren landscape of the golf course. It depressed me so much. I was like, and and I'm talking to people and I'm like, don't you see that it's just nothingness. It's just herbicides and where's the biodiversity? Where are the other plants? Where are the insects? Where are the birds? Like, this is atrocious. Like, why do we have this?
I
And
completely agree. Yeah.
I think it just becomes such a second nature of like, oh, you're supposed to have this curated, lawn. But yeah, I hope that people are having their eyes opened a bit more too.
So I
Um,
like you, I can't look at a golf course without visualizing all the chemical inputs that are required to make it look like that. And it just becomes like, this is a scary place to be. Uh,
mm-hmm.
so much stuff in the ground.
Yeah, chemical wasteland. So, sorry to any of the golfers out there, but check and see
Oh, yeah,
what you're walking on and the impact it's having on the local environment.
I'm sure there are places that do a better job of holistic management of their
Mhm.
turf, but the typical example is relies a lot on chemistry.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned college campuses, and yeah, there's this aesthetic in many places that college campuses should look like golf courses.
Mhm.
And my feeling is like, what would be wrong with UC Berkeley's campus looking more like Tilden Park, the wilderness behind it? I would prefer that. There's also some notions around land management, landscape management, where people say, well, the moment you let the first weed pop up, people will then start littering. They'll feel like this isn't
Mhm.
an environment that people tend to, and it kind of encourages bad behavior. I haven't seen that. I think that may be just folklore.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't. Another thing, once you remind people that our food really does come from the ground, um, their attitude towards the ground can change. And if you really get it because you start picking food, from your front doorstep, you're probably much less likely to dump motor oil there, or rat poison, or
Yeah.
whatever it is, because you think this is actually a resource. And
Mhm.
I have taught classes on things like emergency preparedness, like how do you get, salad from the sidewalk after the seismic event? What are you going to do
Mhm.
after the earthquake? So I thought I was preparing people in the Bay Area for something like that, and I only realized that the pandemic was another opportunity. So foraging during the
Mhm.
pandemic is a chance to not have to go to the grocery store as often, to have a bit of food sovereignty and control over what's going on, have some physical activity that's socially distanced, start to relate to the environment in a different way, get in touch with your inner naturalist, which we're all born to be.
Yeah.
We somehow learn to tune it out. I mean, a way that I've described this is, in our culture, we've turned control of food over to a food clergy that tells us what is and isn't food and sanctifies it in some particular way. So the dandelion that's growing in your yard is not food. The dandelion that's in a plastic bag in the grocery store or the farmer's market is food. It's been blessed and sanctified, and we are somehow not even empowered to recognize it as food unless it comes in a plastic bag or on a plate. Um,
Yeah. No, it's like I just had a vision of I've seen even like plastic wrapped bananas in the store. I'm like, what are
yeah,
we doing? What are we doing with the waste and around our packaging of our foods? And I think there's so much there's so much power in knowledge. And if you look at what truly makes a resilient food system, it all comes down to local knowledge and understanding not only what is safe to collect and eat, but also how to prepare that, how to store it, and also how to distinguish it from other toxic species. I mean, we can't go into a discussion of foraging without putting out some disclaimers because, you really need to educate yourself, and there are lots of resources out there, but you don't want to, mistake one plant for another or, or one fungus for another and have a toxic event. But there are plentiful examples of wild plants that are edible if prepared correctly.
yeah. So I think this is a good chance to say that when we talk about a plant being edible, that doesn't mean that you can eat any part of the plant any
Mhm.
season without, preparing in a particular way. What it means is there is some part of the plant, when harvested at the right time and prepared in the right way, won't kill you.
Mhm.
Uh, so that said, there are plants that are, wonderfully edible from, root to flower petal, and dandelion is one of them. Um,
Yeah.
like the puffballs particularly, but the roots, the root crowns, the stems, the leaves, and the flowers are all edible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and this country used to be covered with other resources, especially nut trees. I'm thinking of like the American chestnut was a massive source of food. Of course, we have the chestnut blight that's wiped out a lot of our older trees, but there's also butternut. There's, here in Georgia, we are just past serviceberry season, which are also known as Saskatoons and Juneberries.
Mhm.
So there's lots of trees that also provide food to us. And I find that sometimes some of the biggest arguments that kind of public space planning committees have around the planting of fruit bearing trees in landscapes, the argument against edible landscapes is, well, what will we do with all the mess? And there's a local forager and real advocate for fruit trees in Atlanta, Robbie Astrove, who has to say, this is a problem that we can eat our way out of.
Yeah,
you
no,
know?
I mean, Falling Fruit is an organization that tries to map the availability of fruit trees nationally. But yeah, it's a problem. Problem of surplus food is a problem I'd like to have. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we have in Atlanta, we also have an organization similar to that called Concrete Jungle, and they map fruit trees. They organize volunteer groups that will go out and collect the wild pears and other fresh fruits during the right seasons, and then they bring those to food banks and places that are distributing food to people. They make amazing ciders and jams and all kinds of fun things. I mean, so we are surrounded by foods, and in many cases, just people don't necessarily know how to recognize them. Yeah.
Yeah, there really is an empowerment thing. We've really been taught to be afraid of stuff,
Hmm.
and instead of learning about it. I mean, education in this should start when we're toddlers, right? It's like, this is safe to eat, that's not safe to eat. I mean, it's just a shame. It's fundamentally human. It really is core to being a human being to be able to go and recognize food in the environment, and we've just lost that as a culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in some cases it goes even a step beyond that. Many children today can't recognize, whole vegetables, much less like that you get at the grocery store, much less those that are foraged. But that's a discussion for another day. I know that you forage a lot in California. Can you tell us about some of your favorite foods to forage and how you prepare them?
Sure. So, I mean, first, I'll say that I tend to forage primarily non-native invasive species.
Hmm.
And you see the same non-native invasive species all over the world. Um, Most of what I eat was from the Eurasian continent, some from South Africa or South America. There are a few local native species that I do forage a lot and that are abundant, like California bay laurel nuts,
Hmm.
which they're about the size of an olive when they have the fruit on them. They're like a mini avocado. The tree is actually related to the avocado, but the stone, if you roast it, it's very pungent bay flavor before roasting, but when you roast it, it ends up somewhere on the coffee chocolate spectrum.
Mm.
Uh, you can use it instead of chocolate chips. You can make truffles from them. I've used them to make mole and things like that. Brittles, not like nut brittles and whatnot. They're absolutely delicious and incredibly abundant in season, and they will keep for a year just in cool, dry, dark storage. Um, what have I, in the last few weeks, the kinds of things I've been foraging, several mustards. Hirschfeldia incana is one that we get a lot here, Mediterranean short pod mustard. The leaves are a little bit fuzzy. The flowers are delicious. It's a relatively mild mustard. Um, let's see, Brassica nigra, black mustard. That's much more pungent, much more fire in the mouth. Again, the flowers are fun. I tend to collect a lot of the flowers in season and dry them and use
Hmm.
them as a garnish. When they're
Oh.
fresh, I do things like put them under the skin of chicken before roasting chicken, and you get a lovely yellow color to the flesh, almost like you'd use saffron or something like that, and
Nice.
kind of mild spiciness that's really delicious. Some of the mints are starting to come in, including some local mints. Let's see, there's a woodland calamint that's been going. That is a non-native, I believe. But Yerba Buena is starting and Coyote Mint is starting, both of which are local. Miner's lettuce season is already over. That's one of my favorites, but that's something that is a native that we get, very abundantly in season. Chickweed is mostly gone until we get a little bit more moisture. We're starting to get some fog drip now as part of summer, and that may bring some of the chickweed back. That's one of my favorites. It's just so approachable. It's, anybody who could stomach alfalfa sprouts, would find it, kind of on the delicious side. What else? Yarrow is in. That's more of an herb than a vegetable. California sagebrush is in right now. Again, more of an herb than a vegetable. I tend to use those things in preparing meat and fish, but I also like infusing them into spirits. Maybe that's what I should have brought for the show and tell. Although my liquor cabinet's behind me, I can show you some of that.
Well, that's great. I have a little something in my cabinet behind me as well. Elderflowers just finished flowering in Atlanta. We're at the very tail end, and so I have a big vat of elderflowers just steeping in grain alcohol that will become my own version of Saint Germain very soon.
Yeah, ours have flowered a few weeks ago. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the fruit.
Yeah. That's great. What are some of your favorite liqueurs to make from wild plants?
Well, I'll grab some here. Give me a second. I'll be right back. All right. So through the magic of video editing, we're back with booze in our hands. This is pine and purple sage. This is gleaned orange zest and green juniper branches.
Wow. So how are you making these? You're just steeping them in grain alcohol, or are they infused?
Most of what I use as a base these days is Oakland Spirits here in Oakland bottles 153 proof brandy.
Oh.
So this is a grape-based spirit. Sometimes I will infuse into grain alcohol and sometimes into a gin. So for example, let's see, this one is the Botanist gin infused with pine sap that I foraged in the Sierras. It's got a wonderful smoky, piney thing going on. Yeah, this is redwood tips and shoots. I don't know if you can see, the color's not, this one's a little murky. Peruvian pink peppercorns.
Oh, nice.
Yerba Buena and Coyote Mint, two native California mints.
And do you add sugars to these, or are they just in the brandy? The brandy's a little bit sweet already, right?
I like bottle them as tinctures that are still at very high proof, and then use them as an ingredient in a cocktail or sip them as a schnapps-like thing.
Yeah.
But I don't tend to make liqueurs. Some of the things I make are closer to something like a gin. This is a pineapple weed. Which
nice.
is, familiar with it. It's like a wild chamomile. These are actually California poppy flowers, which have a slight almond taste to them. They're beautiful golden color. Yeah. Green redwood cones actually are still super tannic and do something like that. It's fun to, these are mustard flowers, and that ends up having like a slightly garlicky taste to it when you do the extraction. More poppies and this and that. Yeah. So what was I going to say? I mean, it's a way to bottle the season in a fun way as well.
Yeah.
So you like remember what things looked like at that time of year, and like drinking it the next year when the flowers or the herbs come back is a lot of fun. Things that have a fair amount of oil in them. So this is actually gleaned orange zest. Orange is growing in the neighborhood. Doing an extraction in something as high proof as this, you can get so much oil into solution that when you add water, it makes a louche like absinthe does. So it turns cloudy. I mean, I can do a demonstration if you would like. It's kind of fun.
So talk me through what you're doing. Yeah.
Day. So this is, can you see this pretty well? It's
kind of nice, kind of golden colored. Oh wow, and it turns cloudy as you add water, just like it would with absinthe.
Yeah. What happens is when the alcohol concentration gets lower, the oil that was in solution can no longer stay in solution. It goes into suspension and makes the cloud effect. So
That's
anyway,
really cool.
yeah.
I've got some things here that I made this past week. This is my, I guess it's not exactly forage, although I did steal it from one of my friend's yards, some fig leaves. And this is a recipe from one of my friends, Suzanne, who's based in the UK. And basically, you take like 7 fig leaves, 300 grams of sugar, 375 mils of water. And you kind of boil that for 20 minutes at like a light bubble, leave it overnight, and then pull out the fig leaves and then add 50-50 gin to your fig liqueur. And it's just amazing over ice or ice cream, which is one of my favorite things to do. And then this is my...
Do the leaves taste like fig?
They have this really magical flavor. It's hard to describe, but it's different from the fig fruit, but really nice, really, really nice.
The fig leaves tend to give out that sort of latex sort of stuff when you break them, but yeah.
Yeah. But the latex doesn't really. There's no like milky latex in the final product that you see. These are my elderflowers that I've got going with a little bit of some lemon zest, and so I'm just going to let this steep in grain alcohol for about a month. It's usually what I do with my limoncello too. Is I let it just sit in the dark cabinet for about a month before I add. Simple syrup or like a cream base. I'll have to kind of play around with it, but it's a lot of fun to make these.
Yep. Better living through chemistry. That's it.
Yeah. There you go. That's great. So when you think about this topic of edible campuses and herbicide-free campuses, like what would you envision for like a college campus to look like? And would you integrate education into that landscape as well?
So we actually have a plan at UC Berkeley to dedicate a plot that's near the north side of campus. It's called Observatory Hill, to make a wild and feral garden that would have a number of functions. So first, it would be a demonstration project to show that you can have a very low input, productive, and still beautiful place on campus. The idea will be to think about the landscape architecture in a way that there's something blooming most of the year. Of course, our climate is pretty mild. It makes that easier than in some other places. Have it also be a teaching lab where instead of permanent signage, there would be something like chalkboards where you could write down what's growing right now, right here. Something about the ethnobotanical history of the plant, what it's native to, where it's been used, what it's been used for, and so on. It's kind of a welcome to campus for people. It would be very distinctively Berkeley, in some way, but also contribute to food security on campus. So it's a combination learning lab, a spot of biodiversity, a demonstration project, and a contributor to food security. More generally, there are places that are trying to, say, reduce their water use by mulching. Well, that's one option. Unfortunately, many mulches that are used for landscape purposes are treated with herbicides themselves. So that's, maybe not the most ecological thing you could do, but there are a lot of low water input things that you could grow instead that make effective ground cover and could also be edible. So I don't really know that other than giving up large lawns, that kind of notion that things need to be manicured, green, pristine. I don't think that things would look that different to most people unless they had an interest in botany, because then they would say, instead of bringing in this exotic whatever to try to make this place look like Versailles, they're planting something that actually thrives in this environment with very little input, and you can eat this part and that part and the other part. Berkeley campus actually has a lot of strawberry madrone trees on it, which produce a lot of fruit, about the size of a raspberry or something. Delicious. Nobody eats them. They don't recognize that it's food.
Yeah, lots of possibilities there. I think both from the planting and the education and utility side. Like I could envision some of these lawns being transformed to kind of natural, wildflower meadows, or with local native species, and that would be beautiful. It would be beautiful, and there'd be a lot of edibles, I'm sure, mixed in there as well. Great. Well, where can people find out more about the Feral and Wild Food Week? I know you have it every spring. Is that right?
Yeah, it just happened last month. It was our 7th year of it. The last 2 years, given the pandemic, have not been had the broadest participation, but I'm very grateful to the foragers and restaurants and bars and distilleries that participated nonetheless. Our URL is forage.berkeley.edu, also osfood.berkeley.edu. OSFood on Instagram and Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how to find us. If people are interested, probably the best way to get started is to find a foraging instructor in your area who really knows what's growing locally and can help you avoid deadly mistakes or painful mistakes. That said, I mean, you've probably given similar advice, but the way that I invite people to approach this is to say, you probably already recognize some wild edible plant, whether it's nasturtium or oxalis or dandelion. You have the start of your green list, so you know that whenever you see that, if the place it's growing isn't terribly sketchy, you can grab some of it and stick it in your pocket or stick it on your burrito or whatever it is, and just add some more micronutrients and phytochemicals and fiber to your diet for free. And then that's the start. So then you need to make friends with another plant. And you just make friends with them one by one, and before you know it, you can have something on your plate every day that you forage yourself, that is hyper local, hyper seasonal, and you have the power, you have the control over it, you have the knowledge. So I think it's.
Yeah, I love that idea, and also thinking of greeting them as friends. I have this habit of doing exactly that when I see a plant that I recognize. I'm like, oh, hello, little blackberry bush. Now I'm going to eat you.
I joke that what's happened as a result of. I mean, I'm not an expert at this by any means. I mean, I know many experts, and I'm not one of them. Again, so we publish a little guide we call the Bay Area Baker's Dozen. It's 13 plants that grow in the Bay Area that are abundant and hard to confuse with anything that will hurt you. It's not really intended to be a plant identification guide, more just a wake-up call saying, hey, this stuff is there and it's abundant. Of those 13 plants, I think only one of them is a native. Everything else is a non-native invasive. As I was saying, I'm not an expert, but once you know a dozen of the most common plants, you will see them all over the world. I mean, I have photos of the same plants in, Jordan, Japan, Mexico, Canada, the East Coast, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. I mean, it's the same things. They're world travelers. They travel with people. They are part of what is sometimes called a transported ecology, that along with agriculture, you bring the agricultural weeds. It's all part of one ecosystem. And as we discussed before, it's one of the things that happens when you disturb the soil. So great, let's use it all.
That's great. That's a great place to end. Well, thank you so much, Philip, for coming on the show. It was lovely speaking with you.
Pleasure, likewise.
Yeah. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Skype. I want to send a huge shout out to the show's producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth of Co-Conspiracy Entertainment. You can find this episode and all of our others at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find the video version of this episode, which has us holding up some delightfully colorful bottles of foraged ingredients in our liquor cabinets at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel under the Foodie Pharmacology playlist. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts. If you go there, please leave us a rating and maybe a comment or two. That would be really helpful in helping us to get the word out about the show. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.